You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. As you may know, I'm in the middle of an exploration on Dutch golf. Prior to commencing this odyssey, I had assumed that investigating the Dutch influence on the game of golf would be a fairly straightforward undertaking. Today's contributor, Robin Bargmann, disabused me of this assumption during our first communication on the matter. In hindsight, he was absolutely correct to do so. Some of you may recall a heretical suggestion that the Dutch game of golf, spelt with either a C or indeed a K, is related to the Scottish game of golf. Fewer of you may be aware that the origin of this proposition was first posited by the Dutch golf historian Steven van Hengel in the early 1970s. Today's guest, Robin Bargmann, is the natural successor to van Hengel. Robin's research on early golf has been lovingly published in a book entitled The Serendipity of Early Golf, which was released in 2010. My plans for this subject matter have changed over the past few weeks, as I've tried to formulate a format that simultaneously does Robin the topic justice. The depth and breadth of Robin's insight and knowledge is extensive. As a result, I'm left with little alternative than to release our conversations pretty much in full, released as 3 separate podcasts over the coming weeks. We very much hope you enjoy the content. Certainly is. So look, I'm going to take my lead from you, Robin, really. You are the expert in all of this, but as you rightly pointed out, if you only have an hour, then maybe it might be, if you'd be willing to schedule another chat, that would probably be useful. But very much so I would like to look at how your work has built on Steven van Hengel's and what that means in terms of the influence that the Dutch had on the early days of golf in Scotland.
Sure. Well, the funny thing about the word Dutch is that it's synonymous with the people living in the Netherlands. Uh-huh. And the Netherlands is basically synonymous with the old northern Low Countries. And that's why you have the difference, actually, since the fall of Antwerp, you have the difference between the Dutch and the Flemish. Uh-huh. And that's why I prefer, actually, in the history of the game of golf in the Low Countries, that it's more Netherlandish than Dutch, and it's even more Flemish, actually. Okay. That makes it a bit complicated, the word Dutch. Okay. Or brings in a lot of confusion. But we'll come across that anyway. Mm-hmm. So what would you like to know? So you would talk about the Dutch influence on the development of the game.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, it's interesting to reference both, certainly as a starting point, the golf editions of both the Badminton and the Lonsdale libraries. There's obviously clearly an understanding with those two books that I have copies of that there is some sort of interrelationship, but they do make the point that clearly golf is no more golf than cricket is poker, which sort of jumped out at me.
Well, the problem of that citation is actually that what Hutchison is talking about there is the newer game of golf, and Van Hengel brought a good definition into for historians, and that's if we talk about the old game of golf, and mainly played on ice in Holland, that disappeared in 1672, and we write that with a C. And after that, a newer game of golf developed, and we write that with a K. Although in literature you have, in old texts you see the C and the K. In very old texts it's only a C, because in Old and Middle Dutch, you didn't have a K. So the K only developed actually in later writing. And the newer game of golf that developed, say, after 1672, and that became the most popular game in the Netherlands in the 19th century. And that's the game that's a short game played on a court of 5 meters by 15 meters with 2 poles, and which was really a contamination of a few games, like Bolle using a larger ball, and then Beugelen actually pushing the ball through a metal ring, and the game of golf, actually using the stick and hitting it with. And so if you look at that game and compare that to, say, Scottish golf, then Hutchison is completely accurate. But he should have actually compared it to the older game of golf with a C. Say the game played on ice before 1672. And obviously, because that was a dead game, didn't exist anymore, he couldn't compare it. The only way to compare it is actually by understanding the early game of golf before 1672, which you can actually basically see being played and illustrated in all these paintings of Dutch masters. So it's a matter of actually analyzing these paintings and try to understand how the game was played. And that's why, people like David Hamilton, a good friend of mine, and say the prime Scottish historian, tries to point out that the old game of golf played on ice and before that on land was a short game, and it wasn't played towards a hole. But all the illustrations clearly show that there was a hole being played to. The player went on his knees to do the putting stroke. And in other illustrations, you see that he's got the golf club in his neck before he's hitting, and that you wouldn't do that for a short stroke. So you can see from early illustrations that it was a long game, played towards a target, and the target was a hole in the ground. Now, when it was played on ice in the Little Ice Age, and especially in the northern Low Countries, so in Holland, it was played towards a pole that the ball markers would take. Ball markers are basically the same as caddies, would take with them, sometimes with an additional club, because they only played with one club. And if that broke, you needed a spare one. And they had also additional balls in case you split the ball. And the balls being played with were penneballen, and that's the translation of a feathery ball. Mm-hmm. So a leather ball filled with hairs and leather, and hairs and feathers, sorry. So you can see in illustrations that is a long game too, played on ice. And the hole was basically the distance that the ball marker would take the pole with for the next stage, say. Yeah? So if you'd basically hold out the first hole, basically pulled out the first pole or the first stretch, he would then actually walk on another 200 yards for the next. And then they would hit their ball towards the ball marker standing and guarding that pole, which is about say, a yard high or a yard and a half, and that he would stick in the ice. It's a wooden ball with a metal pin in the end, so you could stick that in the ice. So that game has a lot of similarities with the game of golf played in Scotland. And so if you try to analyze and compare the two games, and starting from the back end, meaning going back in time, it can be very confusing. So my approach was different. I went as far back in time as possible, and then took it from there going forward. So and that's what the Scots have never done, actually. I've never found a Scottish book on the history of the game of golf, of their own game. They always get stuck in the discussion that it is a Scottish game with similarities to the Dutch game, but it was basically a game established or made by the Scots, which I think is true, at least in the way it's played. But they've actually never given any proof of that. I try to go back as early as I can in describing the game of golf as we find it in texts and literature and illustrations. Illustrations are usually these book of hours, call it the early psalm books or Bible, which were very important in the old days, and all handwritten, of course, because before the days of the printing. And maybe some other written documents, like edicts in towns whereby the game of golf was forbidden to be played in the streets, which you also find in Scotland too. So I tried to find an early connection point between Scotland and the Low Countries. And I actually came, and this is not in my Serendipity book, but this is actually the result of my participation in the research project of the University of St Andrews in 2015, so it's not long ago. And the project was, and this was by the head of the history faculty of the university, Professor Roger Mason. And he had someone who provided the funding, who listened to the name Fleming, of course. Fleming meaning someone from Flanders, as you understand. Fleming is one of the most popular names in Scotland, isn't it?
It's amazing, isn't it?
And if I ask a Scotsman, I said, what's this name Fleming? And they said, well, it's a very popular name in Scotland. I said, where does it come from? Would it mean that it's someone from Flanders? They say, no, it's Scottish. They usually get that as a response. No, it's Scottish. I said, I know it's Scottish, but where does it come from? But anyway, so the project funded by Mr. Fleming and initiated and by Roger Mason was called Scotland and the Flemish People.
Uh-huh.
And there were a number of contributors, and in 2016 there was the end conference, and I had a paper presented there. They gave me 20 minutes. They gave everyone 20 minutes, except if you were more academic. I was, I think, the only non-historian or academic historian. I'm a lawyer. by training. But anyway, it was very kind of them. And Mason, who knew my Serendipity book, said, could we invite you to participate in this research project, Scotland and the Flemish people? And he said, I know you know a lot about the history of golf, but what we do in academic research, if you're trying to prove something, you need basically 3 points that you prove. So if you can demonstrate what you found in golf, or what you think you found in golf, and then compare that actually to other early Scottish games. So I introduced a Scottish game at the same time to be part of this research project, which was catchpell. Now, if I ask you whether you know what catchpell is, you probably don't know.
The answer to that is probably no, unless it's something to do with shinty.
No, and the third one was bonspiel.
Uh-huh.
Now, Scots people do know bonspiel, because that's the old name, say the pre-war name for curling.
All right, okay.
And nowadays the bonspiel is the name for curling played outside, and curling is the name of the game if it's played inside. Now, most of the curling is played inside, so the word bonspiel has kind of disappeared. But it used to be called curling bonspiel.
Okay.
And curling has basically it's to curl. And bonspiel, that's basically a Middle Dutch, or let's say in this connection, a Flemish word. And catchpell is also Flemish. And old Scots, do you know the game real tennis?
Yes, that's the indoor tennis that you can play it off the wooden sides and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, at the rooftops, yeah. But nowadays it's a game of the happy few, wasn't it? Huh? Uh-huh. So you see it at the University of Cambridge and places like that. MCC has a court, Queen's has a court, 2 courts actually. I think there are only 17 courts in England. There used to be one next to Troon.
Okay.
But say in the 16th, 17th century in Edinburgh alone, there were 17 courts.
Okay.
Catchpell courts. And the game of tennis, so it's tennis, that completely changed after 1874, I think it was, or 72, 1874. In the Belle Époque period, when sports were made more accessible for the ordinary man, but wealthy, not the aristocrats only, and for women also especially. So Major Winfield, he invented the game, and he actually registered the game and sold it through Lily White's, and that was called lawn tennis. And lawn tennis was played outside on the grass. And so you had 2 poles and a net, and not paint. So they had these white cords actually on the ground. And it used to be like a sand clock, and then later they made them straight. So from that point on, the old game of tennis is now called real tennis. But that used to be the only game. And it was, of course, the game of aristocrats. It was basically, it was called the game of kings and the king of games. And in Flemish, it's called kaartspel. And so Scottish tennis historians know that that game in Scotland was called catchpell. In Falkland Palace. Do you know Falkland Palace? Falkland is 13 miles from St. Andrews. And that was actually the most popular palace of the Stuarts. That's where they would actually preferably reside. And it was close to the very important town of St. Andrews. It was the religious center and the oldest university. So it was very important. And they owned basically the royal property, where was everything, the woods and the links. That was all. But anyway, the game of kings and the king of games is tennis. Call it tennis or catchpel. So we have bonspiel, catchpel, and golf. Golf is easier, and so you have this etymological or linguistic connection or research that you try to make, and then you go into the history and say, what was the Flemish influence there, or the Dutch language influence in these words and in the culture? And it basically comes down to the period of King David I. So I'm going back in time, and this is an important point. I'm going back in time, and David I, he reigned, say, between 1125 and 1150, say the second quarter of the 12th century. And he was related to William the Conqueror. And William the Conqueror was known to, first of all, to take the English crown and to Normanize England. And you probably haven't heard of the word Normanization, but it's basically changing the state system and culture into a Norman culture. And he was Duke of Normandy. But he was basically paid and funded by the Count or the Duke of Flanders, Baldwin IV. And William the Conqueror was married to Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of the Count of Flanders. And he was also regent for the King of France. He was the most powerful. In those days, Flanders was the richest and most powerful nation in the whole of Western Europe, by far. And he basically funded the invasion or the conquest of England. But Scotland was still an independent kingdom. And William the Conqueror wanted actually also to basically take control of Scotland too. So you do that through family relationships. So when David I became King of Scotland, he was very much influenced by the English court, the Norman court, and he was good friends with Henry I. So he basically Normanized Scotland, and with him came a lot of Flemish knights and aristocrats, because they were already there, because in the Norman invasion of William the Conqueror, the whole fleet was funded by the Duke of Boulogne and, say, the Duke of Flanders, and he was the second in command of the invasion army. So he was his most important military guy, was the Duke of Boulogne. That's a good golfing country. And after the conquest, the feudal system was introduced. So all the old earls, English earls, were basically cut off from power by cutting off their heads. The ladies were allowed to stay, so you did get an assimilation of culture. And the Anglo-Saxon language did survive, although with a lot of Norman, call it French influence, but also a lot of Dutch influence, Flemish words. And if you look at the Doomsday Book, have you heard of the Doomsday Book?
I have.
You have, huh? 30% of the names of the landowners, well, they're not the landowners. The king owns, that's the feudal system. He owns everything, but he gives you actually land. In Dutch, we say in loan. So you are in charge, but you're not the owner. The king always remains the owner. But 30% of the names in the Doomsday Book are Flemish origin. And a lot of those names reappear actually in King David's first court. So when he established his court in Edinburgh, there were quite some Flemish knights and aristocrats actually to support him and get the job done of the normalization. So basically you have to take out all the old stuff and introduce a new modern ways. And his main achievement was the establishment of 15 new burghs. In Scotland, you say bara. When I say a burgh in Scotland, they say, "What are you talking about?" But I always use it. But a burgh is, we have them too in Middelburg, Domburg. We've got loads of burghs. All our cities along the coast are burghs. But anyway, he established 15 burghs. It's like the Hansesteden in northern Western Europe. Basically established and given royal privileges to do the international trade. We would call it international trade. And that was for Scotland very important, actually, to make its next move and establish Scotland as a trading partner. And actually, the only reason is, of course, to develop a lot of income. Now, to found these 15 burghs, you need specialists. You need merchants. You need people who can run a city, who basically also run the church. So you see, actually, the first bishops were all Flemish, and all the merchants were Flemish. And they brought with them, of course, their culture and language. And this is why in the early Scots language, and I have to say here, Scots language doesn't exist anymore. So if people talk about Scots nowadays, that's basically English with a Scottish accent, but has nothing to do with Scots or early Scots. Early Scots started, say, in 1150, and in 1350 you have the first written Scots language, and in 1700, and this was the work of our King Billy, William III of Orange, who became King of England and Scotland, but he basically wanted to rule out the Jacobite influence. And by taking out the Jacobite influence, you basically say early Scots or the Scots language is forbidden. So in 1707, this was with the union of England and Scotland, the official union, where we still live in the union, where you got the Union Jack and the crowns and everything. The United Kingdom. Basically, it was established that the language was English and Scots was ruled out.
So, Robin, you're talking about Scots Gaelic there, presumably, yeah?
No. Scots is basically... actually, the southeast of Scotland was invaded by Anglo-Saxons already, coming from the south. They pushed out the Gaels. The Gaels were their number one enemy. Or in reverse, the Anglo-Saxons, the Sassanites, were the number one enemy of the Gaels. And they established in the southeast of England and also along the coast and also in the north around Sutherland, say the lowlands culture. Now, if I ask you, what does the word lowlands mean? What do you think if I'm talking about Scotland?
You would kind of think probably.
Are you describing the geography?
The geography, yeah. But you're right. What you're talking about is the people, presumably. I would imagine, yeah. So I would think the borders being the lowlands per se, but in a Scottish context. But you're actually talking about the people, yeah.
The old pronunciation and spelling of lowlands was lowlands, lallands. Uh-huh. Actually, the Scottish language history magazine is called Lallans, Lallans. Mm-hmm. George Burns, Robert Burns, sorry, George. He basically reintroduced the word Lallans.
Poet, yeah.
But he was basically an English writer and, made it a bit Scottish. But the Lallans, if I tell you that, it's basically a demographic and a cultural denomination. It's not an administrative. So there's no border in Scotland saying this is lowlands and this is. But there is a borderline in demographic and cultural difference. So on this side of the border, they basically speak Anglo-Saxon, influenced by Anglo-Norman words, and Anglo-Norman that includes Flemish, because the Flemish were Anglo-Normans also. 30% of the Anglo-Normans were Flemish. So the word lowlands, lallands, if I tell you that the Dutch word is laaglands, and I say that bonspiel is bollenspel and catspel is kaatspel and golf and kolf, they're all the same words. So if you go to the Old Scots dictionary, where you can still find actually the early Scots words, 30% of the time you see that the origin of the word is Middle Dutch. That's the official language. So there's a huge influence actually in those days, but what Flemish and Dutch actually always do, within a generation they assimilate, and they won't say I'm Flemish or I'm Dutch. They basically said we're Scots, and it was the new Scots. Don't forget. And interesting, if you go to you were talking about the Gaels, the Highlanders. They're called Highlanders because the other guys were called Lowlanders. So it has again nothing to do with this. So you needed a contrast, you see. And there's nothing low about the lowlands, to be honest. Well, compared to the real lowlands here. Lowlands here is flat. And that's why it's called lage landen or lowlands here, usually underwater. But if you go to the Gaelic dictionary and look for the word lowlands in Gaelic, there's a word for lowlands, huh? And say the Gaelic translation in English is not Low Countries. In Gaelic it says the land of the unfriendly people. So you know who they mean.
Yeah.
And they were basically, the Gaels were kicked out.
Yeah.
And the Gaels actually again had a bad time under the say after the Union and after the Jacobites rebellions, and where they were minimized, and the English started the clearings. You've heard about the clearings in the Highlands.
Oh yeah, well that would be similar to what they did over in Ireland with Cromwell.
Yeah. So all the Scots that you see actually living in Canada, America, and Australia, starting with a Mac, MacDonald or Mac this, and they're all Gaels, and they were all kicked out. Yeah. And there are very few Anglo-Saxon Scots names around. They were all around the wealthy towns in the southeast. So the Gaels, and actually the game, that's what Scots golf historians call an early stick and ball game, shinty, yeah? Uh-huh. And they say that's, basically golf was originally the shinty game. I told you what the relationship between the Gaels and the lowlanders is, so it's very unlikely that they would take a Gael game.
Sure.
They would take a Flemish game. And the early stick and ball game of the Flemish was called kolver. Mm-hmm. I will talk about how that game was played, actually. And they also had a game called shinny, Schynnie. And IE is always Scots for a little, huh? Mm-hmm. Like we also have, you say lassie, caddy, bogey. Mm-hmm. And then bogey is something else, sorry. But anyway, with the E at the end, sometimes Americans do it too, doggy bag. But anyway, but that's real Scottish. And so shinny is also a name for a stick and ball game. And basically the predecessor in language and in game of shinty. Because if you go to the Old Scots dictionary and look up shinty, uh-huh. It'll say derived from shinny. Okay. Now you have to try to establish where the word shinny came from. Now skin, it's actually quite simple. It's basically your shin bone. Uh-huh. Now they didn't play with shin bones, but in Dutch it was known, or in Flemish, that the most vulnerable part of your body when playing the game of shinny was your shin bone, uh-huh. Because it was allowed to hit the shin bone with your stick. Okay. And basically take out your opponent that way. So they would wrap actually woolen skins and thick things around their shins. And I don't have proof of this, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if one of the names of that stick and ball game was shinny, because they basically, and in Dutch we can see it too in another document where they're basically playing golf and are hitting each other's legs and shins and legs. So, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But I'm pretty sure shinty, and if you go to any etymological dictionary, it says it's vague, could be, and if it's vague, the historians of sports or games, and especially golf, they'll say it has some Gaelic origin, and which is very unlikely, because the Gaels were certainly not the Friends and Highland Games, never made it to the Low Countries.
It's interesting, but what you've outlined there, though, really is that there's definitely with the setting up of the burghs, with the interrelationship between the Stuarts and the House of Orange, with the importation of balls from the Netherlands, or from Flanders, and then
you have to be careful here, huh?
Yeah,
because you're skipping a few centuries.
Beg your pardon.
So I'm still in 1150, 1250.
Sorry. After you. Sorry, I was time traveling there.
I'll make it easier for you.
Yeah.
the game of golf as we know it today basically developed around 1500. So you've got the period between 1150 and 1500, which includes actually the date 1457, which the famous edict that you're not allowed to play golf there, and that you have to basically practice.
That was James the First, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And he says he wanted people to devote more time to archery.
Yeah, archery. And you weren't allowed to play on the Sundays and things like that. And that was because there was a lot of war. This was the 100-year war against the English. And these are adolescents. That's between the 12 and 16-year-olds. They basically play the rougher games. And after 16 years, you're basically enlisted in the army. And the original spelling of the word golf there are a lot of spellings, by the way, about 16, golf. And one of them is the golfer, Golfe, and that's basically kind of the same as golfer in Dutch, with an E at the end. So actually, if in old documents you see always not golf but kolve, and if the game of kolve is described, kolven, het sollen met een kolve in Dutch, and sollen is basically the same as in French choulet. The chou and choulet means playing ball. Choulet à la crosse, sollen met een kolve is playing ball with a stick. So the kolve is the stick, and choulet is playing ball. So and playing ball is basically football, and playing ball with a stick is kolve. And the interesting thing is in the edict of that 1457 edict, the first one was actually that playing football was not allowed. And then the second one in 1557 came, and they said football and golf is not allowed. So they included golf. And this is not the game of golf. This is actually the game that was played throughout the early medieval times until, say, about 1500 in the whole of northwestern Europe, and they still play it actually in Normandy. There's choulet à la crosse, and sollen, and this game is actually played between two groups of adolescents with a stick or without a stick. If it's without a stick, it's football. If it's with a stick, it's called golfer. And you basically, and there are teams of about 20, 30, 40, doesn't matter. And they still do it in Normandy, by the way, on certain days. It's basically fighting for the possession of the ball, and you score a point if you get the ball into an area which you call the goal of the opponent. And it's rough. It's basically rugby with hockey sticks and no rules allowed. And they still play it actually in Ireland and in Scotland, but in Scotland it's fairly mild. But I've watched the cup final in your country, in Kilmarnock. Nobody's on the streets on the cup final day of hurling.
No.
Everybody watches the hurling, but that's a pretty rough game, isn't it?
It's a pretty rough game. I mean, the skill and nominally still an amateur game, but the skill set. I mean, it's a much more interesting game to watch than the football equivalent, the Gaelic football. Hurling is a physical game, but some of the skills are just so wonderful in terms of the high catch and. I'm using the word. I'm a left-hander. And I play golf right-handed, but I basically say I play right-handed, but I'm actually playing left-handed, because watch all the ice hockey players and hurling players. I've got my hands this way, Yeah.
and only the left-handers do it this way, and that's less than 20% of hurling players do it this way. The others are always this way.
Correct.
And they're all. Yeah. So I checked with the coaches, and he said, no, they're right-handed, but that's how right-handers play it.
Yeah.
They play. So what I'm doing, playing this way, is I'm playing left-handed.
Okay.
That's why I'm a good golfer. Got a strong left. I don't need to develop a strong left hand.
Yeah.
But so this game of hurling is closest to actually golf as it was played by the ordinary man, and I'd say not the Royals. Royals they played catchpole, tennis, and in the courts in the rest of Europe they played jeu de mailles, a kind of golf-like game with the two poles in the long lane. Do you know that game? Pole mall.
Funny that you mentioned hurling there.
Yeah.
I was speaking with Professor Paul Rouse, who's a professor of sports history in University College Dublin. And he was telling me, in terms of the written text in an Irish context, that Gaelic games, or hurling particularly, has the assumed that every single stick and ball sport that's mentioned in Irish literary, in terms of written down history, is actually hurling. But it may not be. And the chances are it probably isn't.
No. Interesting, yeah. I'm actually also assuming that hurling is originally Anglo-Norman in the southwest of Scotland, introduced by, say, the Anglo-Normans, or the Normans.
Yeah.
You want to put it that way.
Yeah.
The similarity is too big.
Yeah.
And why would it be a Gaelic game in Ireland if it wasn't in Scotland?
Yeah. Well, I certainly know every year there's a hurling versus shinty match, which is kind of a combination of the two sets of rules. Yeah. Which I believe they do it every year or two. So.
Yeah. Well, what you should do then, as actually you'll become a golf historian now, is that you should give a televised interview and say what you're watching now is basically the early game of golf, and not a Gaelic game.
Really put the cat amongst the pigeons.
I know. I don't have a lot of opponents here.
Then we start to feel like Mr. Van Hengel did, I suppose, back in the 70s. We start making.
Well, what I've done in my book, I've basically told everyone that what Van Hengel said was a load of rubbish. Mm-hmm. He was my mentor, but he introduced quite a few myths, which doesn't make it easy. He lived too short. I was actually there when he died. I was working in New York. I lived in New York, and he invited me to the Sunday at the British Open at Royal St. George's, to the clubhouse of Royal St. George's for the traditional luncheon meeting of the R&A, presided by the chairman, and he was an R&A member, and he was allowed to present his book Early Golf to the R&A. So that was basically his ultimate finest moment. You know, they recognized my book. He had obviously published the same work starting in 72 until 82, but 82 was the first year of the official publication of Early Golf. So I arrived at the clubhouse. Wasn't easy to get there because I didn't have a ticket for the Open, and I told them I'm invited for a luncheon in the clubhouse. I'm not going to buy a ticket just to get into the clubhouse. Anyway, so they let me in, and I was inside, and they said, "Well, good that you're here, Robin. But where's Stephen?" And he's not here yet. And these are Scottish people. They could be very English, in their went to the good schools, of course. Lived all their life in England, but they're Scots, you see. And I said, well, I don't know. I flew in from New York this morning, and I was hoping to see him here and I'd congratulate him with his book. And well, we did some research to try to find where he was, and through a Dutch family I know where he usually stayed. We found his traditional bed and breakfast lady at a fairly large house there somewhere near Seven Oaks. And she went up. She said, "Yeah, we haven't seen him indeed." And she checked actually his bedroom, and he was on his bed. He was dead. He died the morning before he was to present his book. That's basically why I took over his work. Well, I didn't really take over his work, but he had already interested me in the early game of golf. And actually, what I'm trying to point out, using the title Early Golf is incorrect, because you're presuming that the game of golf, as it's played in Holland, is the predecessor of the game of golf in Scotland. And where I'm going to is that the game of golf played in Scotland developed from a primitive game of golf played in Scotland, as it was all over Europe, and introduced, by the way, by Flemings during the Normanization process and by King David, the Davidian Revolution. Davidian Revolution is establishing all these 15 burghs and making Scotland into a modern state. And so golf, we've talked about it, as a very primitive game was introduced there. And in the royal courts, and also in the Stuart court, and don't forget the French courts were trying with the Catholic. The Catholic religion was very important, actually, in the whole basis for the Jacobite rebellion was basically the Catholic Church, or the opposition against the church. But anyway, there was a definite protocol amongst the royals all over Europe, what would fit into protocol and what not. And protocol was, and we know that with Mary Stuart, for example, she, as a youngster, she went to the French court. She didn't play golf there. She played Jeu de Maille, Pall Mall. And they don't know that in Scotland. But the courts in, say, the Holyrood Palace, in the gardens of Holyrood Palace, a Pall Mall court was made for her to play Pall Mall and not to play golf. So that they basically said she played golf and Pall Mall because they didn't know what Pall Mall was. But it was similar to golf, but there's no proof at all that she ever played golf, and she wouldn't actually, because that was outside protocol. And within protocol, it's tennis, catchpel, and jeu de paume, as it's called, and Pall Mall, jeu de maille. Those two games were allowed by royalty. Now, the interesting thing is that golf in Scotland, I believe, and you could actually see that the first time in dictionary that golf balls and clubs are being ordered and paid for is by King James IV. And he buys from the bowmaker. He orders clubs to be made. Now, this is 1501. Now, you should know that actually at the end of the 15th century, the racket was introduced in tennis. And the balls had to change because of the racket. So they became larger and heavier. And the old balls, say the feathery balls that you played with your hand, and you had a lot of ball makers, actually, especially in Europe, in Holland, indeed. And those balls were mostly used for tennis, for the handball game. and other. You got a lot of it, but not for golf. That was still in development, and that was basically end of the 16th, 17th century. That those balls, and that's where you see that the balls coming from the Low Countries, from Berg op Zoom, and basically to protect the economy of the country and the outflow of capital, that they say no more imports of balls. And I believe most of those balls were for catchpel and not for golf, but they were golf balls too, at the same time. But they were the same balls. So what I'm saying is that the ball used for catchpel made a crossover to golf, and that the stewards basically developed a game of golf as a royal game. So golf didn't start as the game as we know it today, as a game played by the ordinary man. It started off as a royal game at the steward court around 1500, using the catchpel ball, using the tennis ball, which was also a royal game. And obviously they were looking at the other stick and ball game played over all royal courts in Europe, and that was Pall Mall. And Pall Mall never actually really made it in Scotland, maybe because of Queen Mary, that they said, we want to get rid of all that. Although this is earlier, I'm talking about earlier. No, I'm wrong in my dates. Sorry, Mary was later. So I'm talking about the period of James Stuart IV, at Falkland Palace. The oldest catchpel court, you would call it real tennis court. You should go to the website of Falkland Palace, and then go to the tennis court. That thing was built in, I think it was a new court. I'm actually a member there of the real tennis catchpel at Falkland Palace. It's the oldest surviving catchpel court in the world. It's right next to St. Andrews. Nobody knows what catchpel is. I'm surprised actually that it's a £10 membership a year. I think Queen's is 1,000, and one of the guys has written a book there, but it's basically disappeared actually in the cracks of time of history.
So you reckon there's a linkage between catchpel and golf?
Yeah, and at the royal court of the stewards. And after the introduction of the racket, which was, say, also around 1500, so the earliest, a friend of mine is a tennis historian, and I wasn't allowed to use it for my latest book, but his earliest description and illustration of a racket is 1470.
Okay.
So before that...
Just to clarify, they were using a feathery-like ball playing real tennis.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a leather ball filled with hair, and feathers were introduced later because that... But you can imagine, actually, if you're hitting a ball with your hand, you don't want a heavy, hard ball, do you?
No,
because you're gonna.
Not in preference, anyway.
No, and so actually they introduced gloves for the ladies, but if you're a real man, you play with bare hands. Mm-hmm. You're a sissy if you play with a glove, and then actually to protect the ladies, they invented the racket, which was ash wood with a short handle, so you like a ping pong racket, or bat. So it's a fairly, it's a short thing, and the strings were. Do you know the word catgut?
Yes.
Tennis.
Yes.
Yeah, and do you think that it's gut made of cats.
No.
Cat's gut.
No. I don't know what it's made of, but it's not made of cat gut stuff.
Nee. And in Dutch, it's called kaatsdarm.
Okay.
So the S disappeared actually in English or in Scots.
Yeah.
So if I ask you, so what does catgut mean? And if you introduce the word S back into the language, and etymologists fully agree. Uh-huh. So it's cat's gut, and cats is cats. Yeah. Cats is tennis. Yeah. So it's the gut. It's actually a sheep gut, which you had used for the cat's racket. Okay. So that's why it's cat's gut. It's tennis gut.
In terms of you using just explaining there a game played with the hand, there's a third Gaelic game over here, which is handball. Okay, so you've got Gaelic football, you've hurling, but you've also got handball, which now obviously I'm just hypothesizing this, but the interrelationship between all these bloody games is if you go far enough back, there's a root somewhere.
Sure. Well, but say the cultural difference between the original inhabitants being the Celts, the Gaels, and the invaders, say the Anglo-Saxons and later the Anglo-Normans, they basically they never assimilated. Well, in the last 200 years, they didn't. So it's very unlikely that, so if you say there's a handball game in Ireland, which it's the same as in Scotland, that you would call it Scots, the kilts worn by the Scots nowadays is an invention after the visit of George IV. Okay. And say the 100 years, it was the first visit of a royal in 250 years to Scotland. And what's his name? Sir Walter Scott basically did the whole thing. And the clearings of, let's forget about it, and the disaster of Flodden, where we killed all the. Let's forget all. We're friends. I'm King of Scots too, and I'm here. And he presented himself in Scotland, and Walter Scott came up with all these stories. I've got a good book for you, The Invented Traditions. Okay. And that's a scientific book, by the way. But anyway, so he presented himself in Edinburgh in a kilt. Okay. So he was standing there and he said, I'm a Scot. And basically what he was doing as a Sassenach, the real Scots call the lowlanders Sassenachs, he was basically saying, I'm a Sassenach, but I'm actually a Gael. I'm a Scot. And that's when actually all these Robert Burns traditions and Walter Scott and the Haggis. So all the Scots are now united under this. But it's basically turned into an Anglo-Saxon nation. The number of people speaking Gael, they're coming back actually, and the number of people still speaking Scots, the lowlands. So you basically got first the Gaels were kicked out, and then actually the early Scots were kicked out. The call it the Anglo-Norman Anglo-Saxon combination, and now it's all Anglo-Saxon. And so I have a hard time sometimes with David Hamilton. I said, you should be more Scots than a Scotsman, but he's basically Anglo-Saxon. This project at the University of St Andrews, Scotland and the Flemish people, he was invited actually to in that research project, because it was in St Andrews, and they said, the golf Valhalla of the world is here in St Andrews. Do you want to participate as a golf historian, as the number one golf historian? And he said, no, I'm not interested. We don't want to know.
out of convenience, eh?
Yeah, and so I was invited, but actually it should have been David, although I know more about it. And I said, David, this should be actually a first move on your end, actually, to really investigate the early game of golf in Scotland and forget about the Dutch. I mean, I'm Dutch from the northern Netherlands, and there was actually in the 17th century, of course, there was a close relationship, and we played our game, but our game was influenced by the Flemish, but the game in Scotland was much more influenced by the Flemish and much earlier, say 300 years earlier. And in Scotland, the game of golf was developed by the Stuart court and played probably on the links of Scotland, because that was of St Andrews, because that was close to Falkland Palace, where they resided. And in Edinburgh, you had all these, the 17, later on, these catch pool courts. So golf as a royal game really developed there. And as I said, you should easily be able to research it. And there are actually quite a lot of early Scots documents. But the problem is say the Scottish Anglo-Saxons, which is 99.9% of the population, at least of the Anglo-Saxon population, nobody actually speaks or understands early Scots. If you take a poem of Dalrymple, a famous Scottish poet, 14th century. So he wrote in early Scots. I bet you a good bottle of wine that you wouldn't be able to understand it. And so all these old documents in Scotland are written in early Scots. There's no one to research them. The people who can easiest research them, and there are actually some researchers at the University of Ghent in Belgium, they say we can read it because it's closer to, say, Middle Dutch. I have a problem with reading early Dutch, but 30% I can't follow, and I've been reading through some early Scots documents, but you really have to study it. So there's about 60% I don't know, I can't follow. 60% is a lot. But there have to be documents there, because it's, as I'm saying, it's developed as a royal game, and documents of the Stuart courts by the treasurer, whatever. That's why we know that King James IV ordered clubs and balls. It's still there, the treasury documents. So there has to be, in literature, there has to be quite a lot in early Scots about catchpel and golf and bonspiel. I know about bonspiel. The curling people, they said there may be a Flemish connection, but that. And then there's Sir Walter Scott. He says, no, it's Scottish. And I said, so where does, in Dutch it's called bollenspel, bollenspel, and in Scottish it's bonspiel.
Cultural appropriation.
So catchpel in Dutch is kaatspel. So it's not Chinese being compared to Canadian. And it's all close by, and if you look at the ties, language actually assimilates. Yeah. And to get an assimilation of language, say the immigration of, say, 1% of your population, that you won't get assimilation from that. If you want to have language assimilated in another language, you need a large portion of population and the numbers are 25, 30% in the bergs, the barras. Sorry, I have to go.
No problem. Can we reconvene? Because we've only got. It's been fascinating, Rob. It's really...
But I thought we might. But so I've reached the point actually, so that you could take it from there, that golf in Scotland started in 1500.
Yeah.
And golf in Holland started in 1600.
Many thanks for tuning in. As usual, you can find us online at firmandfast.golf or on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please continue to like, subscribe, and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.